Welcome once again to Bible Class Topics. We're continuing our study of the Gospel according to Matthew. We're in chapter 13. This is part 2 of 2 parts. In this lesson, we're going to consider the highlighted sections of this table: the act of an enemy, the time for judgment, the small beginning, the transforming power of Christ, the working of the leaven, all in a day's work, the precious pearl, the catch and the separation, old gifts used in a new way, and the barrier of unbelief. So before we get started, let's get our Bibles out, and we're going to turn to chapter 13. We're going to read verses 24 through 30, and then we're going to skip and read 36 through 43. So 24, Matthew 13, 24 through 30. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servants said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them in?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" Now drop down to verse 36. Then he left the crowds and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds of the field." And he answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. And he who has ears to hear, let him hear." I'll remind you that I am reading in this study from the English Standard Version. The problem with the tares is that they came up looking like wheat. And what the New Testament calls tares is also known as bearded darnel or darnel. When the heads finally formed and the difference was plain, it was too late to weed the darnel out because the roots were intertwined with the wheat. The Jews referred to the tares as bastard wheat. If eaten, it had a slightly narcotic effect of dizziness and sickness. It was after the threshing process that the women would be hired to come and remove the darnel seeds one at a time by hand. Could a man hate his neighbor so badly that he would do these things to his field? It must be something that was happening at the time, because it was written into Roman law as a crime. This parable teaches that a hostile power is always at work in the world, looking to destroy the good seed, and that we must remain on our guard. The parable teaches that it is often hard to distinguish between those who are in the kingdom and those who are not. So we cannot be too quick in judging people good or bad without examining all the facts. The parable is teaching us not to judge too quickly. Judgment will take place at the harvest. A man will not be judged by a single incident, whether good or bad, but he will be judged by his entire lifespan. and how he came out at the end with God. This makes me think of the comparison of King Manasseh with King Solomon. Manasseh, in the early part of his life, was horrible. He was so evil. But toward the end of his life, he repented and got himself back in a right relationship with God. Meanwhile, Solomon, when we study his life in the Bible, we only see his life degrading as it went along. And we have no evidence toward the end of his life that he repented of some of the things he did wrong. So only God can see the whole of a man's life. And he will be doing the judging in the end time. Well, when is this? The end brings judgment. In this life, it may seem that the sinner escapes punishment for his crimes, but in the end, he will pay. Only God, then, has the right to administer the final judgment. Let's read two more verses. Well, as a matter of fact, let's read three more verses, 31, 32, and 33. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all seeds, but when it is grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. And he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. The mustard seed was used by the Jews as a comparatively small thing. You might look forward into Matthew 17:20. This small seed could grow into a plant that was over 12 feet tall. The point is that the kingdom had small beginnings, but eventually it will encompass many nations. You know, great things generally have small beginnings. When we talk about the decline of slavery in the West in the 17 and 1800s, as it began to decline, all of this began with one man, and that man's name was William Wilberforce. You might want to take some time sometime in your day and just Google him. Wilberforce, Wilberforce. Well, you know, it takes a single person or family to begin a Bible study and to show Christianity to others. A reformation of any kind begins with one person. The death of Telemarchus is what ended the Roman gladiatorial games. After he died, the games began to cease to continue. When we see this parable here, we understand that this was a personal parable directed toward the close disciples. How could they, a band of so few, evoke worldwide change? Well, is this parable an encouragement to us as Christians as well? It certainly must be. That leads us into verse 33, which we can call the transforming power of Christ, the parable from the kitchen of an ordinary house. In Jewish thought, the word for leaven is often connected with evil influences. It would be shocking to Jesus' listeners to hear the kingdom compared to leaven. But what Jesus is talking about is the transforming power of leaven. Christianity transformed the life of the individual, such as those named by Paul in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 and 10. The overall purpose of Christianity is make bad men good. Christianity transformed life for women. We know from our study of first century times that in the Greek, Jewish, and Eastern cultures, The women were virtually treated as property and not as human beings. Christianity changed all that. Christianity transformed life for the weak and the ill. In countries such as Sparta, ill or deformed babies were left out in the elements to die. Christianity was the first faith to hold the ill as more than just a burden. Christianity transformed life for the aged. Because they were no longer able to work, the ancient cultures considered the old to be a nuisance, but not the old among the Christians. And Christianity transformed life for the child. In the first century Roman world, divorce was rampant, and many women changing husbands as often as once a year. Many women were just being divorced, new husband, divorced, new husband. And obviously in this kind of a situation, the children would be neglected. But not among the Christian household where the children were and are cherished. Some say the transforming power of the kingdom works unseen like leaven. They say it's working silently, but inevitably. Others say that the working of the kingdom can be plainly seen. Put an unleavened loaf of bread side by side with a leavened loaf. Can you tell the difference? You obviously can. The leavened loaf has risen. Remember the enemies in Thessalonica, who in Acts 17:6 said, "These men have turned the world upside down"? We have to understand the action of Christianity can be disruptive, it can be disturbing, and it can even have an effect of violence. So in a sense then, both views are true. The kingdom is always present, working behind the scenes, but it stands at the edge of the curtain, ready to reveal itself at any moment. But why the mustard seed and the leaven? I want to read something from Chumbley's commentary to you today. And he also quotes from David Garland's commentary. So let me just read this. A mustard seed and leaven are unusual metaphors for the kingdom of God. Mustard was a lowly plant. Pliny said it grew like a weed and could easily get out of control. And the use of leaven as a symbol for corruption is well documented. That Christ should use it to describe the kingdom is analogous to using rust or a virus for the same purpose. Such iconoclastic images may indicate these parables were more than simple meditations on the insignificant beginning of the kingdom. By inverting common figures of the sacred and profane, Jesus may be stressing that his kingdom accepts the unacceptable, that the tax collectors and the harlots can enter into the kingdom of heaven even before the chief priests and elders. We'll see more on that in chapter 21, verse 32. So the question is not, can something so contemptibly small be representative of the work of God? That's not the question. The question is, can something so contemptible be representative of the work of God? Now, we're about to finish our study, but we have quite a few verses left to read, so let's just finish out our chapter. I'll promise not to jump around the verses here toward the end. So we'll read from 44 through the end of the chapter. The kingdom of heaven is like a hidden treasure in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and he sells all that he has and he buys that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and he bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind, and when it was full, Men drew it ashore and sat down and sorted the good into containers, but threw away the bad. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come out and separate the evil from the righteous and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Have you understood all these things? And they said to him, Yes. And he said to them, Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, and coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue, so that they were astonished and said, Where did this man get this wisdom, and where did he get these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all of his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and in his own household. And he did not do many mighty works there. Why? Because of their unbelief. Well, if you were an ordinary Jew in the first century Palestine, where did you do your banking? You actually did your banking in the ground. You buried your money. You buried your priceless belongings. And the Jews believed in something that we sometimes hear on the schoolyard, finders keepers. And the rabbis taught this as proper. So do not get caught up in the idea that it seems that Jesus is condoning sneaky practices here. This is a parable, and therefore we must look for its main point. And that main point is a man finding something he deems precious will give up everything to possess it. Let's note that he found the treasure in his day's work. Can we find Christ in our day's work? And we see that no sacrifice is too great to get into the kingdom. And that entails accepting God, accepting his crucified Son, and obeying their commandments. We may have to give up certain ambitions. We may have to abandon certain habits, and we may have to take up a discipline of self-denial. And we may have to, and we will, not may, we will have to take up our own cross, and we will have to follow Jesus Christ. The ancients loved pearls, not just for their worth, but also for their aesthetic beauty. The kingdom of heaven, represented as a pearl, is the loveliest thing imaginable. So to do God's will is not a grim, gray, agonizing thing. To do God's will is a lovely, wonderful, and beautiful thing. There are many pearls in the sea, but this man found only one pearl of great price. And, you know, I've seen lovely mountains. You've seen lovely things on this world. Lovely mountains, the sea, the flowers, the birds, lovely human beings, lovely looking food, etc. But, you know, as a man, I can find loveliness in serving my fellow man. I can find loveliness in my human relationships. But even with all this love surrounding us, physical beauty and the beauty of serving our fellow man, these things are less lovely than the ultimate loveliness of accepting God's kingdom by submitting to his will. How does this parable contrast with the previous one where the man came upon the treasure unaware? Well, this man spent his life searching for the pearl of great price. And either way, the sacrifice for the treasure or the pearl must be made by the person who decides to accept God's will. So now let's talk about fishing. Could Jesus have picked a more appropriate parable for his disciples? The fishermen among the disciples would be familiar with both types of net fishing used by the Galileans. They either used cast nets or drag nets. And the parable here refers to the drag net. We sometimes call it a seine. S-E-I-N-E, used in a process called trawling. Now, the dragnet cannot and does not discriminate. Neither does the church. Is the church only for the good, fully committed people? Well, who's going to judge that? As a Christian, we rightly know who's going to judge that, and it's going to be God. But there will be a time that will come when the good and the bad will be sent to their separate destination. And we have to remember that this separation is not our work. This is truly and singularly the work of God. The disciples were about to have a revelation that would shed new light on what they already knew, and they would begin to apply what they already knew in his new service. You only have to read forward into Acts chapter 1 and 2 to see this happen. When we receive Christ, we already have some gift or ability. If that gift or ability is good, then it continued to be good in his service. Here's what I'm saying. Does a scholar give up his scholarship to become a Christian? Does a businessman give up his acumen? Do artists need to give up their art? Do sportsmen need to give up their sport? No, they don't. But they must study as a Christian would. They must work as a Christian would, and they must play as a Christian would. We'll finish up our study of chapter 13 by looking at these verses that come under the heading, the barrier of unbelief. Jesus goes to his hometown. He tries to preach. Well, it's a hard place to preach or teach. And so was Nazareth for Jesus. It just was a hard place. Any distinguished visitor to a synagogue in these times would usually be given permission to speak, and Jesus accepted the opportunity to speak. But he was immediately met with hostility and skepticism. They felt they knew him, and thus knew he had no right to speak as he did. It caused a barrier that Jesus knew could not be crossed. In any congregation of God's people, the audience is responsible for at least half the sermon. If they set up the barrier, then the best sermon ever delivered will not penetrate it. However, if they leave their hearts and minds open, then even a poorly produced and delivered sermon will stoke their spiritual flame. We cannot judge a man by his background or his family connections. They are not reasons for accepting or rejecting his message. It's the listener's responsibility to take the Bible message from the speaker, regardless of who he is or what his speaking abilities are. It's obvious the Nazarenes did not understand what they saw or heard. Review verses 13 through 15. They had the facts set before them, but their minds were closed to what the facts implied. Well, why is there no honor for the prophet in his own hometown? We have a saying in our own vernacular that says this: familiarity breeds contempt. And obviously that's true. They said, this carpenter's son, what does he know? We know him. We know his brothers and sisters. They were familiar with him. And so when he came showing more wisdom than they had, this was contemptible to them. And here's another problem. The Jewish prophets were known for bringing more bad news than good news. If he truly was a prophet, his hometown folks were probably concerned that he was about to unload a bucket full of bad news on them. However, true prophets told the truth regardless. He puts into words what most were afraid to face. The true prophet spells out the implication of hardened hearts in human ways, and thus incurs the hatred and opposition of those that prefer darkness to light. Thank you for joining me today with this study of Matthew chapter 13. I'm looking forward to studying with you again in the next video when we will start Matthew chapter 17. Until then, please subscribe to the channel. Please like this video, hit the notification button, leave me a comment or a concern. And until the next time we meet, may God bless.